charge. And the charge is binding upon us as the vows that we take. And so in that charge, the bishop says to us, you are to love and serve the people among whom you work. I'm supposed to love all of you.
That doesn't mean you have to like us.
Exactly. I do like you. But yes, that's, for clergy, if you don't figure out pretty soon what kind of love can be commanded of you, you could be in great difficulty. So one of the things that I figured out for myself a long time ago is that love is not what we feel, it is what we do. So I don't always like every person that I work among. And that's not just parishioners, that's bishops, that's secretaries, that's, everybody. But I can always act with kindness and compassion and concern for their welfare. I can always have listening ears and a listening heart. I don't have to like people, to love them and be concerned for their welfare. And I can apply that to, I shall love my neighbor as myself. Because all I really need to do is regard, it's not so much doing unto others as I would have them do unto me. Because we don't all like to be loved in the same way. But I can listen and pay attention for clues about how they wish to be loved and regarded. But in this gospel passage, I come flat up against a wall when I'm commanded to love God. I'm not saying I don't love God. I wouldn't be in this job if I didn't love God. But can God command us to love and be? Now, part of this might be that I grew up, perhaps some of you did also. How many of you grew up in the Episcopal Church? Okay, before the 1979 prayer book? And perhaps every week you hear what our Lord Jesus Christ said. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. Okay? And it came immediately before the period. Lord have mercy, because we know we didn't do that. And it was always delivered in this stern and kind of forbidding tone. It was our duty and our obligation. Now, I bring that up because I think we inherited that from the Roman Church. If you go to, now Latin, like Greek and Hebrew, has multiple words for love. We are sort of bereft in the English language, at least as we speak it in America. We got one word, and we love God, and we really love cheesecake. It's indiscriminate, and we fall in love, and it's all the same word. So Latin has different words. They have a word, amor, which is falling in love kind of love, similar to eros in Greek. They have caritas, which is charity, the kind of love you feel in caring for people. Well, they have another word that is sometimes translated love, diligere, from which we get the word diligence. And this was the Latin word that the Roman Church chose to translate this passage into. It means esteem, loyalty, the kind of love you might swear to king or country, or the head of your household. You will be loyal, you will be faithful, you will be true, you will bring them honor. It is your solemn obligation and duty to have this kind of love for those who are over you. Now, it's really interesting that they did this and that we inherited this sense of how to love God, because it isn't what the Greek says. The Greek says agape. We shall have agape for God. It doesn't say anything about duty and obligation and esteem, right? So agape, Greek, has these different words for love. They have eros, which is erotic love or romantic love. They have philia, which is brotherly love, fraternal feeling, the way you feel for friends. And by the way, Latin has a word like that too, the amici. It's the way you regard your friends, that kind of love. And then there's this word agape. Does anyone know what it means? We use it a lot in the Christian church, right? It's one of those words like Lord, that if Americans really had to translate this, right? Or grace. Like, what do we mean by that? Agape. And here's an interesting thing. It only occurs in Greek religious literature. Now, it may have been a word commonly used in the common street Greek of the day, but it does not occur in any Greek literature. So we have to do it by context, and whether people understood the meaning of it or not, even the common folk, I'm not sure, because you may remember that Paul wrote an entire chapter of his letter to the Corinthians explaining to them what agape was. You know, 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, love is generous, love does not boast, right? He goes on and on, trying to explain to them what agape is and how agape is necessary for everything they do in the church. It first shows up in written form in the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of what we call the Old Testament. It's a common usage in Jesus' day. And they used agape for both the love we have for God and the love God has for us and the love we are to have for our neighbors. And it is used frequently in the New Testament and in Greek Christian literature to describe the self-giving love that Christ had for us, that Christ made evident. And if you put all of those things together, it really is, it is a self-giving love. It is a love that is willing to pour itself out for others. It is love that is given with no thought of reciprocation. And some people point out that it is the love that suffers, because it is given freely, and although you don't give it in hopes of reciprocation when it is not reciprocated, because you give yourself, it hurts. And that we suffer as Christ suffers, or as God suffers when they love, and we don't love in return. The Romans actually, because of the Roman Church, because of this idea of agape infiltrated their mindset, Christians who wrote in Latin began to write the word caritas, which is charitable, compassionate, caring for, providential kind of love, with the CH at the beginning, with the Greek word. They merged their word caritas with charis, which is the Greek word for grace. And that was how they translated agape. It was charity and grace together. It was the same idea. And yet, when faced with agape, to love God, to have agape for God, they didn't translate it caritas. They couldn't get their minds around this idea of God. And it may have been because of the hierarchical nature of their society, of life under the emperor, you know. So we're going to love God like we love the emperor, and that's just required of us. That's diligence. Well, Hebrew, and this all comes from the Hebrew. Both of these things do, although they're not in the same place in Jewish law. So the first one that Jesus says is actually the last one given, and it's in Deuteronomy, and you may recognize this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. That's what Hebrews call the Shema. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And faithful Jews say that every day. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep those words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house. I think that was a pretty easy question for Jesus to answer. If we're going to write it all over us, it must be the most important one. Well, Hebrew, like Greek, has these different words for love. They have a word that means brotherly love, like amici or philia. Amici in Latin, philia in Greek. I don't know the word, but they have it. They have a word that is the counterpart to the Latin diligere, hesed. And that is the love that God has for people and that people may have for others, but you may not have that kind of love for God. And the reason is because it's hierarchical. It is providential love. It is the love that you feel towards those for whom it is your responsibility to provide and to care for their needs. God loves us with hesed. We are provided for the things that we need. God cares about our difficulties. It is the love that we as human beings may have for our children, for those who are dependent on us, for the widows and the orphans. And we may have it for others in those situations where we are in a position to provide for the things that they need. It is a caring kind of love. It is similar to Latin caritas. It is similar to charity. It is the kind of love that a king may have for subjects. But since we don't provide for God's needs, we can't have hesed for God. And then they have a third word for love, which is abeia. Abeia is spontaneous and impulsive. It is characterized by joy and delight. It is the love that Jacob had for Rachel. It is, in fact, what we would call falling in love. Although it might also be the love of really good food. It might be, it calls to mind things like children playing on a lawn with a puppy. It is that kind of love. It is provoked by nothing except a spark from your heart. That, in Hebrew, is the love we are commanded to have for God. We are to have a abeia for God. Spontaneous, impulsive, joyful, delighted love for God. It is very much a feeling, and yet it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and in our translation, with all your mind. And here's where it gets really good. You know, when Jesus said it in Greek, he didn't say mind or strength, he said power, with all your power, all your mind. But in Hebrew, it doesn't say that way. It says, you are to have abeia for God, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all of you that is utterly you. That's completely different than power and strength and might, right? That is the essence of you. That is your personality. That is your individuality. That is your gifts. That is your you-ness. You are to love with all of your humanity and all of the things that God has given you that make you different from anybody else. God does not want our love to be like everybody else's love. He made each of us unique. And that is what we are supposed to give back with joy and delight. I don't know that we can be commanded to do that. God thought we could. But God who feels hesed for us, who feels responsible for caring for us, who feels that deeply, wants us to respond as little children respond to puppies and dogs and parents. Just spontaneous and intimate and with what is unique. Almost all of what Jesus says on these two laws are all the law and the prophets. Most of the law that is about loving God is about liturgical practices and religious observances, keeping holidays, going to the temple, keeping the Sabbath. And so God gives us these ways in which we are to act out this spontaneous, joyful response with all of our usness. And if we think about that in our own context, how we might put that into practice is that in our own religious practice, in our own liturgical observances, it is the things that make us unique individuals that God desires we bring forth into our worship. This is what makes those with gorgeous voices want to stand up and make joyful noise. Makes the dramatic people stand up and read. Makes the people who have wonderful work with their hands, big beautiful buildings and furnishings and hangings and clothes. It is to make everything beautiful, and it ought to be for those who like to move to stand up and dance. It is bringing all of our stuff, and even if the gift that makes you you is playing with numbers and making money, please go make it for the Lord. And bring that in too. That is because it is when we give of what is uniquely ours that the gift becomes special and gracious and holy. And it is a joyful and wonderful thing to do. And when God says, love me with all your heart and with all your soul and with all of your utter you-ness, that is what God desires. And maybe we can't be commanded to do it because we all have that little stubborn kindergartner in us that goes, no, not going to, not today, don't feel like it. You know, that's part of us too. And so we bring the stubbornness and whatever it is that is us, and we bring it all here. And then Jesus goes on to say, and in Hebrew, it is the same word, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, he gets that, where did I put my Bible down? Here we go. He gets that, interestingly, from a passage that's not about neighbors, sort of. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizens among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall have spontaneous, impulsive joy and delight in the alien who resides among you. You shall give them the gift of your you-ness. You shall, in the Greek, have agape for them, self-giving love that cares about their needs, that is willing to give without thought of return. It is no wonder that when Jesus, in Luke's Gospel, when Jesus quotes this, that somebody goes, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus then tells them a story about an alien among them whom we call good Samaritan. We have heard we shall love our neighbors as ourselves for so long, and we practice on those that are the most difficult, which are usually the people in our family, right? And sometimes we can think about, okay, so how do I find that in, the homeless person or whoever I'm having difficulty with? And it really began about aliens. And I think that Jesus quoting that is especially powerful because we think that it's the people we're around all the time that we have the most difficulty with. And we get lots of chance to practice this because of the time and place in which we live. But seriously, for the Jews and for us, it's the aliens. And why? They may not look like us, but they don't have our culture. They don't understand how we do stuff. And that can just be a Baptist walking with the Episcopal Church. But it could also be somebody who comes from a different place where everything they do, the food they eat, how they congregate, how they get work, how they dress, it's not our customs. We want to acculturate them and make them us instead of having this spontaneous, impulsive delight in your presence. It is a challenge to us to learn to practice this. And it's interesting that when we practice having this kind of love for people, it becomes so much easier to recognize how to display this kind of love for God. And when we practice this kind of love for God, it automatically changes our hearts and our souls and helps us practice it for others. It is no wonder that when Paul wrote this famous passage to the Corinthians, it is a chapter that comes immediately after a chapter on spiritual gifts, on recognizing, not trying to claim somebody else's, but living into our own. And he points out that even if you're using all your spiritual gifts, you don't have agape. If they are not given with love, they are not with giving. But at the same time, without the agape, without loving ourselves and working that out in community and loving others, we won't ever recognize or claim the gifts of our utter humanness that we are called to give to God. So this is the place where God might as well have said to us when we are commanded to love, that we know ourselves, that we recognize how precious and uniquely we are created, and to claim all of our utter usness as a wonderful gift that we are delighted to give back in joy.